Welcome to week 5 of MPAI 600 here at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies. Start off typical announcements. November 25th, which is on a Sunday after Thanksgiving, as I've mentioned many times, Zoom conference groups 1, 2, and 3. So I'll send you the link this week, and you'll brief about 20 to 25 minutes for a brief, 5 to 10 minutes for questions and issues. So group 1 will go at 9, group 2 will go at 9:30, group 3 will go at 10. I'm looking at a PowerPoint format as well. What I want to also just say is how you brief is up to the group. If you want one person to brief, you can do it. If you want 5 people or 4 people to brief, you can do that as well. And I understand not everyone from the group can make it because of time zones and travel and those types of issues. So divvy the work amongst yourselves, how you want to answer the question. So that'll be groups 1, 2, and 3. If you are, for everyone else, paper 2 is due individually. Paper 25 November, that's groups 4, 5, and 6. So, again, I've given you this over the Thanksgiving break. I know it's a little bit rough, but I think some people might benefit from having days off, while others might need to work around it. So, just go ahead and start working on that right now. So review. I know it was a long week, a lot thrown at you in this week, but I think these 2 case studies are critical for not just if you're in the national security realm, but even if you want to look at business intelligence or other lessons where these pathologies occurred. So Iraq WMD, and I can't emphasize this enough, the Iraq WMD occurred along the entire chain. So we talk about the intelligence cycle multiple times throughout this course, and there's multiple points where there was failures. There was failures in collection, as many of you pointed out in your discussions points. 2 points. One, the HUMINT curveball was a classic case study of bad collection, bad human intelligence. And that was the original sin right there. We could talk about how that information was politicized and analyzed wrong, but it's very simple. It was collected improperly. So that was a massive failure in collection. We didn't have other failures. We didn't have assets on the ground besides the UN weapons inspectors. We also had failures in imagery, and or probably specifically, we had inability to cross-queue collection assets. The 60 Minutes did it after the fact when we used imagery to analyze the wall around Jezr Nadal, the bioweapons place that was talked about in the curveball piece, but clearly a failure in collection. Failures in analysis. Groupthink occurred, again, at the analyst level, particularly when we talked about those famous aluminum tubes, which is brought up in those other the documentaries that you saw. Those were classic, forced to achieve a consensus that the aluminum tubes were used for nuclear weapons design, when in fact they were not used for nuclear weapons design, and there was competing theories out there. But because of groupthink, because of the desire to reach consensus, it was written off as nuclear aluminum tubes were analyzed as nuclear components. And there's other cases that are brought up about groupthink, but failures at the analytical level. And a lot of those things that I mentioned in week 2, whether it's groupthink, confirmation bias, and those other analytical techniques and the structured analytical techniques that you discussed in your previous class, they come into this issue when we're looking at failures at the analytical level. Organizational failures. 2 points here. One, all the intelligence was filtered through one man, George Tenet. And if George Tenet says there's WMD in Iraq, there's WMD in Iraq. And that tells you that that's an organizational failure, that despite having all the nuances and all the competing hypotheses at the mid-level analysis, if there's only one person speaking for the entire intelligence community, and you're basing assessments based on his or her biases and viewpoints, that's an organizational failure. You don't want to have that single point of failure for your entire intelligence process. There's other organizational failures. The Rachel Maddow documentary brings up how there was a parallel intelligence apparatus set up by the Department of Defense that brought information, zoomed it up to the higher levels that was, say, crappy information. So that again, arguably is a failure in organizational issues. And then the policy interface. I think this is where politicization comes in. This is really talked about in the Rachel Maddow documentary, where again information was it was politicized. It might not have been a force to change assessments, but there was certainly pressure and a desire to bring up more favorable intelligence to the political masters than the nuances and anything that undermined an overall narrative. So again, that's policy. Those are some of the issues with the Iraq WMD case study. 9/11, was 9/11 an intelligence failure? And you hear me in the lecture. I argue yes, because of those two known 9/11 hijackers that were watch listed, but they weren't stopped, they weren't followed, an investigation was not opened up, despite having signals intelligence that they were engaged in nefarious activity. One question I always have is what do you do, and I should say, what do you do if Bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S.? And the reason I bring this up is because the Bush administration gets a lot of criticism for this, but I don't think that's fair. In fact, such a threat like that is so vague that you can't action against it. And the one thing I want you to take away from this course, as well as many of these lessons, is, as I mentioned, what I called the Sharma theory back in the day, is the intelligence has to be focused and relevant enough that you can take reasonable countermeasures. So if George Bush comes up to you and says, if you just tell him, what do you want me to do? And you have nothing to respond, then you haven't given him intelligence that can drive a decision or drive countermeasures. If you had said something like, Bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S., and sir, I recommend we put airport security at a higher threat level, or something along those lines, which is a reasonable measure, then you've bracketed the problem to allow him to make a decision. And then the organizational issues, again, the NSA documentary brings it up really well. I'm not going to cover it too much, but just emphasize that information was known at one part of our government in the NSA, but it was not disseminated down to other parts of our government through organizational and bureaucratic reasons, whether it's down to CIA or, more importantly, FBI and other, or San Diego police that could actually action that information. So that's a massive disparate in organizationals. And then I ask again, I laid out the scenario of 9/11, and when we think about, could 9/11 happen now? Could it be stopped? Ask yourself, where along the chain could you have stopped a potential 9/11 from happening? So I want to just take a second to give some guidance on paper 2. I can't emphasize this enough. So this is your strategic paper, case studies. I can't emphasize this enough. Do not give me laundry lists. If you're going to focus on Iraq WMD, do not give me 15 reasons why the intelligence community failed regarding Iraq WMD. Please focus your paper. You can write a 1,500-word paper on human failures and the Iraq WMD problem. You can write a 1,500-page paper on organizational problems that led to the Pearl Harbor intelligence failure. Do not give me everything on the plate. I cannot emphasize that enough. What I'll do is I'll allow you to do either a case study if you want. If you want to do an outside case study, please let me know as soon as possible so I can kind of guide that way. But if you want to choose one of the case studies in this class, you're more than welcome to. So you can choose a case study and go in depth, as I mentioned earlier. Or if you want to talk about an issue and talk about how multiple case studies illustrate it, and maybe your issue is core human collection, and you want to talk how in the Yom Kippur War, the Iraq WMD case study, and the Confessions, you saw bad intelligence collection, and that is the problem with your intelligence failures, you are welcome to do it. So again, you can do it in two ways. Focus on the historical case study or focus on an issue and go in depth there. But depth, depth, depth. I can't emphasize that enough. And just to go over again, some review here. Failures in collection. Pearl Harbor, we could talk about the lack of aircraft carriers and inability to collect on the aircraft carrier. Massive failure in collection. Yom Kippur War, the over-reliance on one human source. And organizing your entire intelligence apparatus around that one human source was a failure in collection. The Iraq War, human, again, was as I mentioned earlier with the curveball, that was a collection failure. Failures in analysis. I apologize, I said Pearl Harbor. You can talk about the failure. That many of you brought up in determining whether Iraq had or the Japanese had the ability to attack Pearl Harbor, and how that analysis was put aside through many of the indicators that you talked about. The Confessions. This was a failure in analysis that brought those 4 people to be arrested or to spend a good portion of their lives in jail. Information was through confirmation bias and vividness bias. Information was poorly focused on. And then Iraq WMD groupthink, as I mentioned earlier. So again, there's failures in collection, failures in analysis, politicization, policy interference. Iraq WMD, I don't need to go into any more detail on that, but the Confessions, there was arguably the Confessions is an example of politicization because there's pressure to get an arrest and a pressure to achieve a narrative that leads to an arrest and evidence that leads to arrest. There's not pressure for justice, and that is a significant politicization. And 9/11, I just talked about it, so we talk about it in a second. Then again, there's failures in organization. 9/11, the NSA documentary, Pearl Harbor. There was information collected, as I mentioned last week, at the federal level that was not disseminated down to the commanders on the ground. The fusion centers, which are supposed to solve some of these organizational issues, and if you want to do an analysis on the fusion centers, would they have stopped the 9/11 attack or any of the others attack, you're welcome to do so as well. So I've listed, again, all these potential pathways for your paper. Do not give me this laundry list in your paper. And any one of these sub-bullets here can easily be a paper in of themselves. So again, to go in the proper depth. So that reviews paper 2. If there's questions, I'm standing by your email. If you want to talk in person, even on Thanksgiving, give me a call. We can kind of have either a Zoom conversation or a telephone conversation. So you can to answer your questions. But please don't leave this till the last minute. Please start working on this now and then focus forward. So unfortunately, what we have to do is, because it's a compressed semester, I can't give you a full week to do your paper. At the end of the course, you're going to have more time to do the paper in the final, but now paper, and then you move right along with your class. So week 5 is counterterrorism. We're going to look at Fort Hood, underwear bomber, Boston, EU. You have the readings. You have the Zagar on the Fort Hood shooting, and then the congressional report on the Boston Marathon bombing. And then you have 2 excellent documentaries, Christmas Day Bomber on PBS or BBC, and then the EU terrorism PBS Frontline documentary. And the question is, why do we still have these failures? Despite billions, trillions spent on intel, why do we still have intel failures still occurring? And again, as you go through the documentaries, go through the reading, try and get that in the back of your head. And I know it's a lot to ask to do your paper as well as to this, but in order to stay abreast with the class, we need to kind of keep focusing. So if there's questions or issues, please let me know. and I look forward to your papers this week.